Hello everyone, this is Lala, and today I'm going to do the long-awaited Era 4 recap/retrospective video of the challenge. So obviously I finished watching the flagship show in its entirety, and Battle of the Eras just ended a few weeks ago, so I was able to fully grasp Era 4. So I'm also kind of doing something different with this video where I was going to make this two different videos, but I decided to just combine them together. I am going to discuss the state of the challenge at this point and what will probably be the future of the show. So that will be at the end of the video, but I'm going to follow the same format for the other three era videos I did for here, where I'm going to discuss my general thoughts on each of the seasons. Then I'm going to go into the casting trends, or going through the cast of the season to go through casting trends, and then also talk about the trends with the themes and all the stuff. Who are important people in the era, who are supporting characters, stuff like that. So let's just get right to it. Let's not waste much time. On to the first season of the era, which is also the first season that I ever watched of the challenge, and that is the challenge Vendettas. Obviously, Vendettas was the start of the era, and it had a lot of changes that would permanently affect and change the show. It would be the first season to cast people outside of the MTV USA audience, as they casted several people from UK reality stars, and they started casting from Big Brother on the season, with both being pretty good but controversial choices at the time. This is where the real world was officially finished and wasn't coming back, so they definitely needed another show. And this would also be the last season that primarily had Are You the One people in it, so it seemed like they're preparing for this well ahead of time. The format was relatively simple, though the cliffhangers took the fun out of a lot of the watch of the season, but it's not much of an issue on a bench, which tends to happen with seasons. It did have a few good moments like Melissa versus Cam, Devon versus Bananas, Pizzagate, etc. But it doesn't really have the high highs of a lot of the Era 3 seasons, or heck, even some of the Era 2 and 1 seasons, and the final was kind of stupid. The Troika being weaponized by the men also wasn't the best, but it's also relatively pleasurable or a light watch overall. The season is a light and pleasurable watch. I think the cast worked out pretty well, with it being a heavy Era 3 cast, and a lot of the rookies here being notable throughout the next few seasons. It just doesn't have a whole lot of moments in comparison, but I have warmed up to the season compared to my last watch. Another point that I want to add about this season is that it still had a lot of the vibe of the Era 3 seasons, where it was still pretty light and fun, but there's also a lot of drama and competitiveness as well. But there wasn't a dark vibe to the scenery, the color scheme, and the show didn't take itself too seriously like a lot of the Era 4 seasons would. I also forgot to mention that this season was the very first season where they had one winner overall, and it was really dumb as hell, and I didn't like the choice or the twist of it. So, Final Reckoning was the end of the trilogy that absolutely no one knew existed until the season took place, but it was essentially a Rivals 4, but with the quote unquote Bloodlines format of having mixed gender pairings, which was a complete and utter mess due to the fact that they put a lot of equalizers when it comes to some of the male male teams, or whenever a male female team was competing against a female female team. Though there are some challenges that benefited the male teams, it was just a disaster, really. Redemption came back from Dirty 30 when no one asked for it. And we also had mercenaries entering the game throughout the season, where one entered mid-season and the other about 3/4 throughout the season, which just made things even more unorganized, especially with how the double cross was utilized in Redemption, where if you're not chosen in the double cross, that is you going home. But losing 2 to 3 eliminations, like Polly and Natalie did, causes you to stay. The issue with the season is that the format was way too messy, and with all the to be continued stuff, it was too much to handle, and there's no integrity from a gameplay point of view. What I will say about this season is that it more than makes up for the flaws in the format with the drama, where there's always something going on from the very beginning to the very end, and everyone from the season contributed a lot to the season and the drama. And the drama is very, very memorable too. If you want a season that's just a mess, it would be this season. And I still had some of that older school, and by older school, I'm really referring to Era 3 at this point, vibes as well when it came to the casting, the focus on drama, the brighter color palette, so on and so forth. They continued casting from Big Brother here, but it seemed like they gave UK a break where they cast a lot of people from X on the Beach, USA. So, yeah. But with all the backlash that came with this season from the casting and the formatting and the editing, it was clear that there needed to be a huge change, and they definitely made those changes behind the scenes for essentially the rest of the era. If I remember correctly, they switched producers before War of Worlds 1, and we did see a lot of the changes by the time this season took place, where it really feels like the start of a new era, and this season would be the template for what Era 4 is kind of known for, in the positive and the negative. So they stopped the continuous to be continued on the episodes, and they simplified the format where a vet is paired with a rookie, and on this season a vet is considered someone who did at least one season compared to the prior gauntlets where you had to have done 2 seasons to be a vet, and the pair goes home together. It's clear that they wanted the season to be more athletic, and we do see a lot of the UK and Big Brother newbies here, with the latter especially flopping. And we also had a lot of newer people who've done 1 or 2 seasons at this point in time, or heck, this could have even been the rookie season, make names for themselves here. The twist after the halfway point to make it individual was not the favorite, and I didn't care for it, but I didn't dislike it as much as other people in the fandom did, though some of the momentum definitely did slow down. While it is a good season and I enjoyed a lot of the drama in the season, I do think that a decent amount of the cast members, especially the rookies, were kind of flops, and I think that a lot of it had to do with the fact that a lot of the rookies didn't have the most longevity, kind of caused the impact of this season to weaken and to be minimized. Or at least when it comes specifically to a casting point of view, when it comes to the people that they cast from the season. I do think that is the start of the over focus on competition, though at least they showed most of the drama on this season, and casting random international people. But there's still some of the, or enough of the messiness, fun, and the good pacing in the season to make it worthwhile. Also, this is the final episode to be an hour long, or at least when it's airing on TV, really 40 minutes long, where every season after this had an extra 20 to 30 minutes added onto it, so it calls for different pacing after the season. We also saw that a lot of the more established veterans at this point in time go home, where they would have taken up the screen time more often than not had they just stayed. So it's definitely a cleansing palette season. And if you want to watch a modern season, this would be a good start. Now we are going to move on to the first and only sequel of the season, though when it was filming, it was titled something else and really wasn't a sequel, but that was post-production or post-filming magic. Anyways, War of the Worlds 2 is definitely the most political season of the era, and as someone who does like the strategy element of reality TV seasons, making the teams UK and US really didn't matter much in the grand scheme of things was interesting, where the two big alliances were the two actual teams, and both alliances had people from opposite teams in it. The drama really kicked it up a notch this season from the very beginning to the very end of the season, where a lot of it was gameplay oriented and a decent amount of it was personal oriented as well, so it's a good mixture there. What I will say is that, like last season, and even more this season, the veterans carried the season all around, essentially, where the rookies were relatively boring, and more boring than some of them last season. I did like how tense and how high the stakes were in the season, which you really don't get that vibe in a lot of the other seasons after this, and there's so much tension here. Also, getting a team season finally after all this time where they really cut down on it after Era 2, and the only team season in the second half of the season is Battle of the Seasons 2, but even that had smaller teams. Anyways, having large teams was really fun again, and they still made it a lot harder this season than all of the other team seasons, especially of the first two eras, where there were still a lot more people getting eliminated on average on this season, and just because you made it to the final doesn't mean you're going to make it to the end, where they purged roughly half of the finalists before the last part of the final. It's really the last season that balanced the competition and drama well and still had a lighter palette in comparison when it comes to the color scheme and all that jazz. I do think that a lot of the drama this season and on social media at the time, and the fact that a lot of the finalists did not go into an elimination, caused them to change the format for the next few seasons, and a lot of the magic has been gone from this point onwards, which definitely isn't good. So, at this point, we're roughly in the middle of the era with Total Madness, and this was the season where I started to notice the shift in the era, and not for the better. It was the start of the gameplay oriented twist to make things actively boring and to almost kind of guarantee certain results, as it brought the skull twists that everyone needed to get to the final. So essentially, people kind of just needed to throw themselves into an elimination so they could get a skull, and that, yeah, I think this season it was a skull, and that skull would make them eligible to go to the final. And this was obviously done as a response of people complaining about how many people on War of the Worlds 2 made it to the final without ever going in. It essentially made all the gameplay boring/pointless, with everyone essentially volunteering, and the choice of having the bunker as the location was just horrible, to the point where they needed to insert oxygen in the bunker because there was a lack of that there, and there's several cast members and produce and film crew in that area, so that was a huge issue. Despite that and all the dark color schemes, which increased from this point onwards, there was a decent amount of drama in the season, and I do think that the cast was relatively good for the most part, and I think it's the last decent rookie class out of all the seasons after this point onwards, or up to this point. You can tell that some of the initial UK and War of the Worlds people were being phased out, and with the whole deletion situation, which was just overtly performative as fuck, not only did the edit ruin the season, especially in like the second third of the season, but it also changed how they edited a lot of the other seasons, where when these very tough, real life, awkward, and honestly painful situations happen, on OG Challenge and on the real world, they are aired out and they'd go through it. But with the climate of the world, especially at the time the season was airing and a bit afterwards, and networks just wanting to avoid all sort of controversy, they just edit it out completely. It isn't a hateable season, but it's easily worse than all the preceding seasons in the era. It does seem like the last season to have somewhat of that trashiness that the network and the show is overall known for, but they were trying to dilute it even here, and they will dilute it even more after the season. Also, this is the final season that has less than 19 episodes, so the pacing gets worse from this point onwards, and this is the final season of the flagship that would be filmed, or this would be the final season of the flagship that would be the second filmed in a year, where from this season on last season were from the 2019, the prior two seasons were from the 2018, so on and so forth. From this point onwards, one flagship show is filmed a year, so that's another change. So, half of the era is complete as of Double Agents, and it is the first season that was produced during the pandemic. Not the first season aired during the pandemic, as Total Madness filmed right before the pandemic and aired during the pandemic, which caused for a lot more issues, and I think it probably played a factor into the sanitation of the show. Of course, they wanted things to be as safe and as uncontroversial as possible, partially due to the climate that America was in at the time, which is why there's an overall bland feeling to the season and it's hard to distinguish it from its neighboring season. It also doesn't help that the skull twist that was on last season was brought back for this season, which was still lame as hell and made the gameplay relatively boring. Since, like last season, there are still people who are essentially volunteering to go into elimination, and it really took any sort of fun or intrigue out of the season, and it calls for Leroy and Cam and Big Brother and Natalie essentially to dominate the season. There was an attempt to get the winners out, but they forgot about that very early on in the season. But there was that BB against everyone storyline that did bring some drama. I felt like there were some stakes, at least. A decent amount of the vets from last season came back here, which somewhat plays a part into the stale vibe, and the rookies on the season is arguably the weakest ever in the era for sure, and arguably the weakest rookie crop ever, or it's definitely close. The veterans, some did a decent enough job, but with the restrictions regarding COVID and them having to sequester people, them not being able to go out to the club due to COVID being a thing, and things being more sanitized, this season overall was just kind of meh at best. This was also the start of the seasons being 19 episodes long, in addition to them already being an hour and a half in length, making it an even more draining experience. By the time of this season, any sort of influence or pullover from the first War of the Worlds was essentially gone by this point, where the only one who was cast at this point from that rookie crop was Josh, and a lot of the veterans that were prominent during that point in time were no longer getting cast either. And the trashiness that the challenge was kind of known for was pretty much gone by the time of Double Agents, and it only got worse afterwards. So I forgot to mention that last season had the whole spy thing, and they continued that with this season. I was really hoping to like Spies, Lies, and Allies more than I did the first time, and even the last time I rewatched it a year or so ago. But I ended up disliking it even more than I initially did. So it's not a season that ages well or gets better without the recency bias. I think all the vets but Amanda were on last season, and whatever tension that there was between them last season was killed before this season. Not only due to the creation of the Vacation Alliance, but all the veterans deciding to work together. One thing that I will say in a positive or positively for this season is that I'm very grateful that the Skulls twist was put to bed, buried, never revived, cremated. But the format they decided here, with anyone being chosen to go into elimination and creating rookie pairs based on everything around, in addition to the increasing trend of a mid season twist, made the season drag out more and more. Yes, this season is the start of the consistent theme that we have where there's a mid season switch where it's usually used as an excuse to guarantee the 19 episode count that MTV wants for the show. And it really just makes things even worse. And right when things would somewhat get interesting with the first format, they switched it where they were on large teams and then they're able to pick off the people low on the totem. There was a little bit of drama early on, especially with the whole Fessel and Amber stuff, and even kind of Brenner too, but that ended pretty quickly, and there's absolutely no stakes in the season, so there's really no reason for me or anyone else to really care about what was happening on the season. I will say that the rookies are a bit better this season than last season's rookie class, and we had an increasing trend of casting random people who are from random countries, random shows. Some of them weren't even from shows, and they're just way too insular for their own good, and it really causes a lack of continuity when it comes to the new rookies. It was just a boring, tepid season that represents everything wrong with Era 4, in my opinion. Casting a bunch of random international people with no connections and knowing no one from the show, everyone playing for an appearance fee, and the veterans phoning it in, poor twists and a dragged out season really just caused the worst of the worst to happen. And continuing on with this dry spy theme and the dark color palettes that makes it physically more hard to watch and more boring to watch and look at. I think out of all the seasons in this era, I'm probably just the most bleh or meh or just nothing about Ride or Dies in general compared to all the other seasons in the era where I have stronger feelings about those than I do about this one. Ride or Dies is a season that on paper should have been akin to the Era 3 seasons since it was relationship based, but instead of it being about exes or rivals, the theme of this season is pretty self explanatory since it's about positive duos of people who are friends, siblings, or something along the lines of that. The issue with this ended up being that a lot of the ride or dies, whether it was the veterans or the rookies, did not end up being ride or dies or weren't actual ride or dies when they were cast for this. Some of the veteran choices were made due to essentially recency bias, and others were put together because their actual partners bailed, with this being most prominent with Anissa and Jordan. And the rookie slash newer people really failed with this pairing slash format. Just going through this season, really, there really isn't many high points when it came to the game, when it came to the drama, or really the competitiveness either. Them having to nominate four people if they won the daily caused for many of them to throw the challenges, and splitting the cast in teams during the second half, like they did last season, also made it abhorrently boring too. It's not intolerable, but it was another season that really lacked at the stakes department, which is partially due to the Vacation Alliance also being relatively prominent during the season, and the 3 episode final really sucked too, and they should really never do it again. It's not the worst season of the challenge, but I will not be shocked if it's in the bottom quarter or hanging right above there, since it's just very little, or there's very little to get from this season. It did seem like they were trying to prop up the ride or die rookies compared to at least the last several rookie classes, so I'll at least say that. But in general, there's really not much there. So, as we are approaching the end of the era and looking at least the last 3 seasons, especially when it came to the rookies, it was clear that they wanted to try something new, and they realized that there's been an issue with the rookie retention over the last few seasons. Hence, battle for a new champion becoming a thing. The casting could have been a lot better, but they clearly wanted to focus on the last few rookie classes, and I think with that being the goal, the cast is okay. I will say that the biggest issue with this season is the format by far, where the 3 phases of Control, Chaos, and Conquest caused for the pacing of the season to be really bad. Especially with the Chaos portion being half of the season and the champions coming in, where most of the cast in the final didn't even go into the elimination. And with the way it worked, there was a point in time where no one went home for a quarter of the season, and 2/3 of the cast made it to roughly around the last stretch of the season. I think if the format was better, the season would have been a lot more interesting and better received. It was a cute enough experiment though, and there was a lot of drama here than there was in the last few seasons, which says a lot, but a lot of the cast was not the most charismatic either. Essentially, I do think that they realized that they were in a rut with the show, retaining their newbies, trying to establish newer veterans, and the older veterans as well. But they didn't trust the cast that they had for the season to carry it on its own. So it's just a conglomeration of a bunch of weird stuff, and it's kind of in its own world, especially where as I'm recording this, we are 2 years removed from it. I don't see much from this season really carrying on into future seasons. So this kind of being seen as a new era, a new group of people, it doesn't really seem like it's panning out. At the same time, this was the season where no matter what, people would have hated it because the same tired veterans that aren't really bringing anything to the show weren't on it, and people are going to automatically dislike it based off of that. And it's pretty unfortunate. But I'd be lying if I say that this is a good season, but I don't think it's the worst of this era, specifically, for sure. I guess there's still time to see if the season has more weight in the future, but that time's kind of running out as well. Battle of the Eras was clearly meant to be the end of the era, especially with it being the season that officially declared and defined the eras of the show canonically. They brought back 10 people from each period of the show and got most of the big legends back. Of course, they couldn't get all of them, but most is decent enough. Cutting 1/3 of them makes sense, but it took a whole lot of the wind out of the season, and the target's twist essentially made alliances irrelevant for a lot of the season. Since if you were not a target, you got no focus, and it cut down a lot of the strategy of the season that could have naturally developed as well, and a lot of the so called allegiances, especially in the first half of the season. There were some moments throughout the first half of the season, but it got painfully boring during the second half, where the target's twist made things suck. I didn't care for the whole Bananas Angels versus everyone else storyline that kind of took part in the third quarter of the season, and the people who made it to the end were relatively boring, so it just made an already stale long season even staler because of the people in it being stale and boring. And then the final was a complete mess, with most of it consisting of swimming, and then the karma point is just lame, as it actively discourages drama and tension through the season, encouraging everyone to be on their best behavior, as if they are on a season where the jury determines the winner. For a season that was supposed to be so epic, it definitely flatlined as the season went on and was kind of a meh at best way to end a meh at best era. Outside of Ride or Dies, this is probably the season that I feel the most meh on and have like the least strong feelings about in one way or another. But I definitely do think it's better than Ride or Dies. But in general, it's definitely not as epic as they wanted it to be compared to, heck, even like a Dirty 30, which was a big season, despite all the problems with that season, too. And I also think the season kind of showed that a lot of the veterans are very stale. But we'll get more into that when I get into the casts of each season in the era. So now is the time we're going to go over the casts in each of the seasons in this era to notice casting trends, talk about some people making their comeback, some people retiring for good or going on hiatuses, and some notable debuts and the dynamics amongst the cast. So I mentioned in Era 3 that there's been only a few Era 1 people, and that kind of remained the case with this season, but we did have a few comebacks, like Brad coming back after being off throughout the entirety of Era 3, fresh from his divorce from Tori, and Veronica and Shane kind of continuing their comeback momentum from the last two seasons here, so they're the only few Era 1 representation. I kind of discussed in Era 3 that the presence of Era 2 people diminished exponentially. So Bananas and Chimera being the only Era 2 people really isn't shocking, and there are large staples at this point. Just from looking at this cast, I see a lot of blues, which represents Era 3 people, where we have some earlier Era 3 people, like a Zach and a Marie. We also had a lot more, and Jemmy at this point too. They're the kind of early Era 3, as well as Leroy. We had a lot more of the Era 3 people who debuted within the last few seasons. Corey and Tony were on their fifth season by now, so I guess you can't really call them newer. But there are people who debuted on Invasion, like Nicole, Kayla, and Sylvia, who are here for their second or third seasons. Devin Nelson also debuted on Rivals 3. This is like their third or fourth season. And Nicole Ramos would be on her last season, as she was the first person essentially gone from Era 4 as her time on the show just kind of came to an end. Because they had to cast from outside MTV because the real world was cancelled for good at this point, they knew that they had to cast from other countries and other shows. So they decided to pitch Victor and Natalie from Big Brother 18, where Victor was an obvious flop, but Natalie was an overwhelming success, which would lead to more of Big Brother 18 people being cast next season. And it led to more CBS people being cast overall. We got a lot of British people, like a Melissa, Kaylee, Joss, Rogan, and Cal, who had their notable moments throughout the next few seasons. So there are definitely some to look out for, and they proved that the UK invasion was very successful, which is something that they'd focus on over the next few seasons. This season will also be the last where they cast a bulk of the Are You the One people, as that show started kind of going downhill around this point, where Cam, Eddie, and Alicia all came from Are You the One 5, where they had their love triangle situation, but Eddie was DQ'd and Alicia was booted right away, where Cam was the only one who made it far in the season and appeared on other seasons. Overall, I definitely did like the dynamics of the Vendettas cast, where we had many different people playing the game. There's definitely some drama and some notable moments and some interesting dynamics here. And they're kind of getting their foot wet, and you really felt like, okay, the show doesn't need a Johnny Bananas or a Kai Maria, despite them making it far, but the newer people, especially the late era 3 people, were making their presences known, and the very first group of Air 4 people blended in well enough. Since they were going with the trilogy mess, it makes sense to kind of continue casting in the way that they cast the last season, which meant more Big Brother people, more MTV people, and more people who are very dramatic. So just from looking at this chart, you see a lot of blues, which means era 3 people, and a decent amount of pinks, which means a lot of era 4 people as well. So they brought back a lot of people from Vendettas onto Final Reckoning, which makes sense since a lot of the pairings of the season were established from last season, especially when that would have been the only season that the Era 4 people could have done before this. And due to this, we also got 3 more people from Big Brother 18. Technically, Polly was cast from X on the Beach as well, but they literally pay a complete dust compared to the other X on the Beach people that were cast here, and he's titled Big Brother 18. So Polly, Devon, and Jose join Natalie with being the Big Brother representation for the era or for the season. So they continue testing people from Big Brother. Like I mentioned in the last video, there was no one from Are You the One that was cast, but instead it seemed like they are planning on making X on the Beach US their feeder show replacement, which is why we got people like Angela and Faith on the show. I think Derek did X on the Beach after the season, and I guess you could somewhat count Polly, but I kind of already discussed him. We have a lot of Era 3 people, where Jemmy and Jenna were paired due to Dirty 30. Derek and Tori were exes on Dirty 30. They gave some half-ass reason for Corey and Devin that I really don't remember. Um, Carmia and Marie and Johnny Bananas and Tony had their fallouts from last season. Kind of same thing with Josh and Sylvia, that was a stretch. Ashley and Hunter hooked up on Invasion of the Champions. And then Melissa, Cam, as well as Kaylee and Kayla were paired together due to last season. I think Nelson and Shane were paired together due to Invasion of the Champions. Amanda and Zach was a stretch since her feud was with Jenna, but they did become real life rivals. Angela and Faith had issues from X on the Beach. CT and Veronica was honestly kind of a stretch too, just because I believe he called her weak on on Dirty 30, but that really came out of nowhere. So they've done many seasons beforehand, and Brittany and Chuck were exes from their Are You the One season. Technically, Chuck is really the last one that was consistently cast from Are You the One. Technically, since there'd be a few more added after this, but it'd be a drop in the dime. Anyways, I think this cast was very great. All of them got into several arguments throughout the entire season. I felt like this was really the last season that had that MTV drama-centric trashiness and fun vibe as well that a lot of the Era 3 seasons had, and that would be something that was missing, or that will be missing from every other season after this. And I feel like they really had something going here, but then they kind of decided to change it. And this is the peak Lavender Ladies and Young Bucks, which are starting to become a thing from Invasion of the Champions onwards. And it peaked here, but a lot of them would either stop being cast on the main show, stop being cast at all, or they would just be heavily dispersed. So the impact of this alliance, or these people that were supposed to take over the show from this point, kind of faded from here on out. And I think with the change in producer and the change in theming, it caused for the rest of Airport to feel very different. But I do think that this cast is great, though a lot of the rookie class really don't do much. Faith got a second season that ended well. Polly's the only one that did many seasons. I guess they want kind of count if you count All Stars. But in general, that's really it for the Final Reckoning rookie class, though they had their memorable personalities. So I mentioned when I was recapping War of the Worlds earlier on in this video that there was a change in producers, structure, theming, and tone when it comes to this season compared to last season, and it's definitely notable when you look at the cast. They decided to do kind of like a fresh meat season here, which technically would have been Fresh Meat 4, since Battle of the Bloodlines would have been Fresh Meat 3. Though the Fresh Meat here were former reality stars, but they're paired with a partner, and then they had to work with that partner for a lot of the season. So they continued casting people from Big Brother USA here, where we had the Nolan twins from 17, Morgan from Big Brother Over the Top, and Josh from Big Brother 19, but with three of the four of them being booted right away. I think, in my opinion, they realized maybe they should hold back on casting from Big Brother people. But on the vet side, we had third season Natalie, who would do her last season here, and sophomores Polly and Devon, who made huge splashes on the season, though it'd be Devon's last flagship season at least. But they kind of held it up for the Big Brother people. We also got a few people from MTV. Just from looking here, we had actually no, was Party Down South on MTV? It might have, it might not have. I don't remember. I think she's an MTV personality. And then we had Gus from Floribama Shore, which was definitely not the most random, but just because he didn't keep that same energy here that he did on the house, they decided not to cast more people from Floribama Shore. But as you see here, there's no one from our youth, the one on the rookie side. And I guess you can mention that Morgan technically was probably cast from X on the Beach too, though they mention her being from Over the Top more often. And we definitely did have a group of UK people, which continued the trend from 31 with people like Theo, Georgia, Steven, Ashley, Zahida, and I think that's it. And they definitely, for the most part, were notable on the season, and they'd get more focus within the next few seasons after this, and they kind of blended in with the Vendettas UK people, but we'll talk about that. And speaking of the UK vet people, just from the top of my memory, I think Cal's the only UK veteran on the side, so I guess that wasn't the best, but I do remember them holding back a lot of the veteran UK people at this time. We did have, in my opinion, kind of the negative trend of casting random international people for the show, which really just brought the casting down. Um, but we'll talk more about it as we get to the era where people like Alan, who's I think he's a Mexican American, so I don't know if he counts as an international person. But him, JP, who's from Brazil, neither one of them strong in English, and due to that, it caused them to not have the bond with people. D came from Australia, which was kind of random. And then Turbo came from Survivor Turkey, and he had a language barrier too, but luckily for him, he was interesting enough to kind of overcome that. And while it mostly paid off here, it did set a bad precedent for the rest of Era 4. And just from looking at a lot of the rookies on the season, a lot of them were outright flops on the seasons, and the ones who did get another season, they got themselves not cast anymore due to problematic antics outside of the show, where, as I'm recording this, the only people who are cast in the modern challenge are Toboro, Theo, and Josh, which really isn't a good track record based on the amount of people who debuted on the season. So when it came to the veteran side, a lot of the more established veterans at this point were booted. So this is essentially CT and Johnny Bananas, their Era 1 and Era 2, and a lot of the earlier Era 3 people got booted within the first half as well. So we had Zach and Leroy, their early Era 3 booted. Um, Ashley isn't early Era 3, but she was a vet at this point. She got booted as well. And then Amanda and Jenna kind of followed afterwards. So when you really look at the top half of the veterans cast just from here, you see 3 to 4 Era 4 people who lasted long in the season, which kind of caused Era 4 to get a lot more focus here. And the only really true veterans that somewhat hung around were Nanny, Carmaria, and Wes. But yeah, I do think that the dynamics with this cast really, really worked out, and you can definitely tell production really, really liked it because they essentially tried to replicate it every season 6 to their own detriment. To me, War of the Worlds 2 was the culmination of the whole UK casting theme or trend of the challenge, where they split the cast into Team US and Team UK, with a few international people or random people being like, uh, what are they? Like randomizer people where they could be put on either team. I don't know the exact terminology for it right now. And I think they did this way too soon. One, the veteran UK people at most only did 3 seasons before this and are on their fourth, and the only one who fit that was Kyle. The rest only did either 2 seasons beforehand, and this being their third season. So someone like a Joss and Kaylee, or they did 1 season beforehand, like Rogan, Bear, Georgia, and Theo. And since the teams were USA and UK, even the most established veterans on the UK team had nowhere near the amount of experience and knowledge as the US team, so it caused for an easy steamroll. And it also didn't help that all of the rookies of the season were cast from the UK, so they could add more to the UK side since obviously they needed more of them. And honestly, the rookie class of War of the Worlds 2 is debatably the weakest in the era. Maybe Double Agents has the title or can compete for the title of that. And looking at the cast, the only 2 people who did more than 1 season were Tula, and I think she got on Total Madness by random circumstances, and Jenny, where everyone else only did 1 season and they were very forgetful and unnotable. When it comes to the US veterans, literally the only one who didn't really contribute anything is Faith, and that was due to her leaving right away. But mainly the veterans of the UK and the US team really carried the season, and it was the veterans on the US team who were consistently infighting from the very beginning of the season to the very end of the season. And this was a good mix of political, strategic conflict, and personal conflict as well. And you really got invested in the politics because of the cast and because of the mix of personal and strategic drama that was happening throughout the season. And watching the 2 alliances or the 2 inter-team alliances kind of fight for power throughout the entire season was very, very good. But I think with the times changing and a lot of the drama carrying on to social media, it calls for a change in the casting era. Cara Maria and Polly would be off the show for years after this. Zach wouldn't be on the show after this since it would be his last season. Uh, who else? I think that's really it for the veterans. Yeah, another note that I have to mention is apparently the producers didn't like the War of the World seasons because their big time vets in this season's case, the Wesses, the Laurels, and the Johnny Bananas, went very early. And if they're paying someone so much money just to appear, they want to make a return on the investment. So them going home very early is a waste of that investment. But just from looking at the colors, you see a lot of the era 4 people are representative of the season, which makes sense if half of the cast is going to be on a team where only era 4 people would have been applicable for. We also had the likes of Joss, Kaylee, and Georgia have the last seasons here out of the veteran UK people, and this would kind of be the start of the end for a lot of the UK people that debuted around this time. Rogan had a improved season where he went from the first boot to a winner. His mess with D would carry on until next season. Theo's injury would cause him to be out of the show for a while, and you start to see some of the War of the World's rookies kind of get phased out at around this point. And right when some of these changes were being made, it caused for the casting and the drama of Era 4 to be weaker in comparison. So, looking at the cast of Total Madness, I noticed two things. One, they wanted to go with a smaller, more insular cast when it comes to the size of it, where the last few seasons had bolder casts, and it really didn't pay off like that. And the second thing I noticed is that the rookie crop mainly came from CBS. I'm assuming that after casting all the rookies from the UK last season didn't really go well, they decided to go back and focus on getting more people from CBS, since the initial CBS crop from early Era 4 really weren't on the show like that. And it seemed like for Big Brother, they mainly cast from Big Brother 20, where obviously we had Swaggy, Bailey Fessel, and Casey make their debuts here. We got one person from the Amazing Race in Jen, which was shocking. We finally got someone from Survivor in Jay, though he did X on the beach too, like a year beforehand, so they're clearly trying to work his way in. And we finally got another Are You the One person as Asaf, though they tried to brand him as one of those international shows, but they recognize on the second season he's from Are You the One? And it shows how they're not consistent with casting people from Are You the One anymore. And they decided to cast less rookies. And I think had they focused on this type of casting, things would have been good. And I think this is the last decent to good rookie cast of Era 4. It was small, they all came from recognizable shows that American people, the audience that counts for the ratings, can watch and identify with. But they didn't stick with that. So, looking at the veteran side, we do see a lot of Era 4 people as the likes of Kyle, Melissa, Dee, Rogan, Josh, Maddie, Tula, and Bear were already established at this point, though this would be the last season of Maddie, Dee, Rogan, and Bear, which kind of ended the War of the Worlds era, or trilogy as you call it, due to problematic elements that they all engaged in outside of the show, and some of the trashiness kind of left with them. And it caused for a few of the UK people to really represent outside of this season, where not many of them were cast after the season. When it comes to the more established vets, we do see a decent amount of Era 3 people, like in Ashley, Tori, Jordan, Kayla, Jenna, Nani, Nelson, and Corey came back after a few seasons off as well, where this would be the last season of Jenna, where she started her family, and I think the show was really getting to her and Zach, and honestly, I'm fine with it. Kayla will start to wind down from the show due to the pay disparity and just being over it in general. And then we, of course, had the oldie people like Anissa and ZT, who've been representing Era 1 since early Era 3 at this point, and Johnny Bananas and Wes here, where their newfound friendship was focused on that I really didn't give an F about. But yeah, I don't really have a whole lot more to say. I think the veteran cast was pretty decent. We had some OGs, we had some of the more established people by now, which were the Era 3 people, and we had some of the more established Era 4 people here as well, and some of the new keys that would become more prominent during the second half of Era 4. I do think that there was some decent drama in the season, but like I mentioned earlier, the bunker, the isolatory elements, and the twists in the season, or the format of the season, really kind of just dampened it. And the whole deletion thing edited out any sort of drama that did happen in the last third of the season that we didn't really get to see. And due to COVID, the civil rights movement that was happening at the time, and just everyone being uber sensitive, it caused a change in the show. And it most likely wasn't for the better. Now we are in officially the post COVID world, and this is the point where any sort of influence or tie to the War of the World, especially the first one, was completely gone by this point, as the only remaining figure from that rookie class is Josh, and essentially anyone who had prominence during that season outside of like Kyle isn't on this cast anymore. And we have a whole new crop of rookies. Speaking of the rookies, this is debatably the worst one, or tied with the worst one of the entire era, and honestly, arguably even of Era 3 as well. since I believe there's like 10 of them and only two of them, i.e., Nam and Amber, return. And Nam's returns really don't count since he was DQ'd right from the very beginning. So, really, only Amber returned. They also started casting more random people who had no connections to anyone, like Joseph, Leo, who wasn't even a reality star, Michi, who was from X on the Beach 3, so I guess that might be an MTV tie there. I might be missing someone else. Nam was also from some random show. Liv was on the same show as Tula, so at least there was some connection there, though it didn't really matter much. Amber M was the last, i.e., the one person to be cast while the show was on, really. Gabby was from Love Island, though she kind of came in by herself. And yeah, the rookies of the season really didn't make much of a mark. And with the fact that most of them being one season wonders, it really makes the season even less relevant. So when it comes to the veteran side, we do have second season players like Jay, Faisal, and Casey was the latter two making it far yet again, and they all had their moments throughout the season. And then you had more established veterans like Cam, somewhat Tula though, she made her name for herself this season, Kyle, Josh at this point, Wes being here, CT also was on the last few seasons, so I kept him as well. We had the returns of Corey, Devin, Nelson, and Doral after they've all been off for a few seasons. I completely forgot to mention Lolo out of the rookies too, though technically she was on Champs vs. Stars, though that doesn't really seem like it's canon. And she hosted a reunion before doing this show, and there's a lot of hype for her, but she ultimately didn't live up to it, and it just showed why she wasn't good for the show. This was supposed to be Leroy's huge retirement season, which he made a huge deal about throughout the entire season, but as we all know now, it didn't really last, so that part's kind of just annoying, in my opinion. Nani was also on her streak of doing several seasons in a row. This is her fourth out of six. And yeah. Oh, I forgot to mention Tori and Ashley, who both had, yet again, poor seasons. This would be Nicole's final flagship season, and the only time she's eliminated before the final due to her injury. I will say that there were some dramatic moments in the season, but I do think the restrictions that happened due to COVID not only causing them to prevent going to the clubs and whatnot, but the limited drinking and the longer sequester period, and just everything being a bit more sanitized kind of caused for this cast to not be as strong as they should have. And with the trend of the international rookies that really don't matter, it just made for kind of a bleh season and a bleh cast. Sorry, I have to correct myself. Corey and Nelson returned last season after being off for a few seasons, but this would kind of continue whatever momentum that they somewhat built from their appearance last season. So we're at the faded Spies, Lies, and Allies, and there are a lot of pinks here, meaning that there are a lot of era 4 people, and to be honest, most of this has to do with the fact that half of the cast are rookies, and speaking of the rookie class, I do think that they are a bit better than the Double Agents cast, at least when it comes to some of their personalities, but there's still way too many of them. And of course, most of them never come back, with the exception of three people making it to the 3 season mark in Michelle, Corey, and as I'm recording this, Michaela. And yes, I did this part right after she was revealed to be on the Challenge 41. But for the most part, most of them don't come back, though some of them do get a second season at least. Because of the fact that many of them really had nothing to do and they were consistently targeted and they weren't given much in the edit, it's really hard to care for a lot of the rookies. And when it comes to the veteran cast, I think all of them but Amanda were on the very last season. And like I mentioned earlier, whatever dynamics that happened between the veterans on last season were wiped away here, where they all decided to work together in the season, and there's no stakes in any of it. So Carol's on his last season as I'm recording this. Casey, Fessel, Josh, Amber at her second season, Nam briefly during his second season, and a few of the later era four people really take over here, and it really shows that barely anyone from early era one, with the exception of like a Kyle and a Josh, made it to this part of the era. There are no era 2 people on the cast, since as you see here, there is no green, which represents era 2. We only have 2 era 1 people, which is CT and Anissa, but that's been the case since like early era 3, so it's really not shocking at this point. And looking at the cast here, there are a limited amount of Era 3 people, with Nani, Tori, Amanda, who came back from her hiatus, and Ashley from The Woman, and Corey, Nelson, and Devin here. So even at this point, you start to see that a lot of the Era 3 people kind of moved on from the show. And I think some of that shift kind of happened with The War of the Worlds and Total Madness as well, to the point where there's so little of them here, despite them being so dominant earlier on in the era. Honestly, I don't have much to say. This cast was pretty stale on the veteran side and the newbies side, and the format of both halves of the season really didn't help it at all. There's also way too many people on the cast, which also didn't help since they couldn't edit a cast this large. And I think this is like 34 or 35 people on the cast, and it was just a mess. I don't want to move on. So, like I mentioned beforehand, Ride or Dies was definitely disappointing due to the fact that a decent amount of the players already weren't Ride or Dies. And looking at the rookie crop, I do think it's a bit better than Spies, Lies, and Allies, and definitely Double Agents, with the fact that one, there's less of them, and two, it seemed like they actually tried to build some lore about some of these people, not only just in this season, but the next few seasons as well. But looking at some of the pairings, a lot of the rookie pairings really didn't do much. Obviously, Nam and Emmy was a joke. Tommy and Annalise, despite being from Big Brother, flopped all the way around. Kim and Colleen didn't know one another at all. Uh, Horacio and Olivia weren't that close to one another, but they had the same management team, but they obviously became the rookies of the season, and it was why some people saw them being huge stars after this. But we even had a lot of the more veteran era 4 people kind of pairing with new people, where, as you see, there's a lot of pink here, but at this point we are at late era 4. But veteran era 4 people included Fessel, Amber, and Casey, who've been on the last few seasons at this point. Same thing with Jay as well. Johnny and Raven was a very fun rookie team, and Turbo brought his non-girlfriend on the show, who pretended to be his girlfriend as well. We finally got Sam and Jack, who are from X on the Beach, but obviously neither one of them really lasted that long. It was cool to see Laurel back after taking a few seasons off, and without Carmaria on the season, where she and Johnny Bananas are obviously the only Era 2 representation here. Veronica and Darrell came back here after their run on All Stars, though they stuck out like sore thumbs. Anissa representing Era 1, nothing abnormal. But looking here, we only have what, like 6 Era 3 people? Obviously, Kayla flopped. Nelson brought over Nerys from either one, so they were an interesting pairing. Jordan was supposed to be paired with Nia, but due to that and Nia's sexual partner leaving, we had them pairing up, and then we had Nani, Devin, and Tori, who have been on the last few seasons up until this point. This was the second season in a row where the Vacation Alliance essentially ran the season. There wasn't a whole lot of drama within the season, and everything was kind of just very peaceful. And whatever messiness that or at least that the newbies got into, was edited out from what I remember. So I found that to be relatively disappointing. But this is like the second or third season in a row where we had rookie class, most of them don't come back for the next season, and the same thing happened here too. So the lack of continuity and focusing on the same stale veterans was really just disappointing here. And I really just don't have much else to say about this cast. Just like I don't have much to say about the season. It's kind of just meh at best, bleh at worst. So we are reaching the end of the era, and it seems like production finally realized that they have a rookie retention problem that has been prominent over the last 3 or so seasons. So as a response to that, and maybe due to them planning season 40 and them needing to save money at least a year beforehand for the appearance fees, they decided to do Battle for a New Champion, where, as you see here, literally everyone is pink since they wanted to develop their newer talent, whether they debuted on the spin off shows or the last few flagship seasons. The only somewhat older veterans that I have at this point that debuted on or earlier in Era 1 is Melissa. Yeah, I think Melissa's the only one who's from early Era 1. Even Tula and Jay, and I guess Asaf, who only did one season, were from mid era 4. The rest of them either came from Spies, Lies, and Allies, which was Berna, Corey, Emmanuel, and Ed, and we had a lot of people from the most recent season, the 38, in Chauncey, Horacio, Olivia, Raven, Nerese, and Mariah. And then a few others from the international spin-offs and USA. And clearly they wanted to focus on the more recent rookies. And I think with that being in mind, I think they had a decent enough cast for what they wanted to go with. Obviously, if they had a Battle for a New Champion and it wasn't era specific, the cast could have been much better, but that clearly wasn't their goal here. We did have more drama here than we did in many of the other seasons, so I will say that the first 4 boots, arguably the first 5 boots, were definitely some of the bigger duds of the season, so it was a good thing that they went home. Tula and Melissa definitely had a huge underdog arc throughout the season, or at least throughout the part that they were there for. Callum had his messy affair with Michelle. Asaph did bring some drama, no matter how cringe it was. Raven had a very interesting arc and had her dramatic moments as well. Sarah, Ed, and Horacio competed well, but that's really the only thing I could say about them. Kylan had a very strong underdog season as well, where he won a lot of competitions and found his way into a lot of drama, where he was actually interesting this season. Michelle was the kingpin or the queenpin this season that was pretty interesting to watch. Olivia obviously had her huge snake moment, and there are moments throughout the season that was leading up to it. I didn't give an F about Mariah and James's romantic relationship, but I was on her side when it came to the Bananas situation. Bernard was an agent of chaos that I wish got more screen time consistently throughout the season. Same thing with Corey, actually, too. I found Colleen to be relatively boring. Same with Emmanuel. Jay was the huge villain of the season, and I wish he owned it more, but he just didn't have that in him. And I think he got drunk with finally having power in the season. And Nerese was also kind of a part of that majority alliance for like the first 2/3 of the season, but then became an underdog, won a lot of competitions, and got into a lot of drama within that season. Based on how they cast 41 and the very next season that they did, it seems to me that Battle for a New Champion is kind of going to be isolated when it comes to the casting and many of them being on future seasons, so that kind of sucks, but it was expected, to be honest. And now we're at the final season of the era, which is Battle of the Eras, which canonized the official eras of the show, and where I was able to pick apart all of the cast to see how representative each era was in each particular season. And with all of this in mind, obviously the 4 eras here are very balanced. So I'm essentially going to go through all of the eras to talk about them being good representations or not, or if they're not good representations. I do think for era 1, they got it right, especially for the people who are willing to come back. Rachel, Anissa, no matter how you feel about her, And Katie definitely makes sense for Era 1 as they've done some of the most seasons, and they have many other iconic moments. Tina isn't a bad choice either, since she does have a decent amount of seasons under her belt. Jodie, in comparison, has less seasons, though you could tell that they really wanted some muscle on the show, and I think she's one of the few Arrow women who would have done the flagship. I think the cast for the Arrow One men is perfect. They're all the most versatile, strongest, most notable Arrow One men who are still competing up until today, so I really have no complaint about Mark, CT, Brad, Darrell, and Derek being on here. To the women are good, or at least most of the women are good. Cara Maria, Laurel, and Kellyanne, no matter how you feel about them, they are iconic. They have done their fair share of seasons and their fair share of moments, and they're strong competitors. Emily hasn't done many seasons in comparison, like at all, but I do think she also kind of benefited from a lot of the Era 2 women not wanting to come back. Aviv's the prime example of this, since literally she only did one season 18 years ago before this, and it's crazy that she's now on season 41. That's shocking. Anyways, the Mets cast is so much worse for Era 2. Obviously, Bananas is going to be on there. He's the most notable challenger ever. He's done the most seasons. He's won the most. Duh. Nehemiah, I guess, makes sense, though when you think about it, he isn't the most notable of the Era 2 men, but a lot of them, including his brother from another mother and Wes, didn't want to come back, the ones who are more notable than him, and he did make a case for himself on All Stars, so I have no issues with him being on here, and he clearly wanted to be on the flagship. The other three, yeah, they are bad. Brandon, who's never made it past the halfway point in any of his seasons. Ryan, who really isn't a strong competitor despite making it to the end a few times. And Derek only having 3 flagship seasons. And while he did 2 All-Star seasons, he really isn't notable at all. And he also debuted at the very end of the season. Clearly, there's a huge hole with the Era 2 men. So that casting wasn't really good. Era 3, I do think for the most part had good choices. Out of the men, I do think the men were cast great with Jordan, Corey, Devin, Tony, and Louis all having the moments, all having a season as well. Though Zach's definitely a huge snub here, though Zach pissed off production and the network, so that really isn't surprising. When it comes to the women, I think 3 of them were good choices. Jonay definitely did a lot of seasons in her early era, and then she has done so many seasons since returning on All Star. She won 2 of them and then made a third final, so she makes sense being here. The other two, Naya and Avery, yeah, they stuck out like a sore thumb, and they really shouldn't be here. Neither one of them really represents Era 3 to me or are notable in Era 3 since they each at this point only did 2 flagship seasons and a spin-off or 2. But I'm assuming they didn't want to put on a few others. Ashley's definitely a snub here. They could have put many more women who are more notable than the 2 of them here, and I don't think the season really changed that for either of them. And then Era 4. I definitely do have some issues with the Era 4 cast. Just like last season, there's way too many people from late Era 4, where just from looking at this, I see Michelle, Kylan, Olivia, Horacio, and Nerys. 5 people who are on 39, and they all debuted between 37 to 39. I think Kylan really shouldn't have been on here. He only did 1 season up until this point on the flagship, where there are many more notable Era 4 men who could have been on here. Horacio is boring AF, but obviously they're trying to build him up here, so him being on here makes sense. I don't think we needed all of Michelle, Olivia, and Nerys. 1 or 2 of them could have been replaced with someone from earlier in the era. Clearly, Jenny was here because they wanted a strong woman and a winner, and Casey obviously fits the same archetype, but she fits the minority quota, so that makes sense. Holly, it was nice to see him here. He definitely represents early era 4, though obviously his comeback was disappointing, and I kind of the same thing with Theo too, but the only difference is that Theo makes it far on current seasons. I definitely think Jay and Fessel were huge snubs here. when it comes to the cast interacting with one another, it really didn't pay off much, especially with the format of the targets throughout the entire season, where those select people were the only ones who were relevant in that round. And a lot of the intermingling just really didn't matter, and it just showed that they really couldn't handle a 40-player cast in the edit, and then cutting a fifth of them right in the beginning, and all of them being the more interesting personalities, really didn't help them at all. So on paper, it's a good cast that could have been better, but in actuality, it's pretty mixed. So, for the other three era recaps, and especially the last two era recaps, I kind of created this calculation where I decided who would be considered the quote unquote faces of the era based on a list that had the top 10 confessional getters in a season. And obviously, with there being 10 seasons, the person who makes it to the top 10 of a season the most is declared the face of the era, or that's the main area that, or the main formula that I am using. And looking at this, we only have 5 people who made it to the top 10 confessional givers in a season more than 3 times. We have Car Maria, Johnny Bananas, Nelson, and Cal, who got there 5 times, which is half of the seasons in the era, and Tori has one less season with 4 seasons. So those are kind of the people, and looking at the list, it's kind of disappointing, and it really shows the issue with the lack of establishing a lot of the era for people, as none of them made it onto this list. Yes, Tori is argue that she's era 4, since she was on the very last season of Era 3, and most of her prime obviously came from the 10 seasons afterwards. And Nelson, he debuted on season 28, but even by the time Era 4 started, he had a few seasons on his record. But they're still very much Era 3. Johnny Bananas and Carmuya essentially were the main faces of Era 3, and that didn't stop with Era 4, as we clearly see here, with the two of them being at the very top. Even with Maria being on a hiatus for the second half of the era, and with Johnny Bananas taking a few seasons off as well during that second half, and him having some early boots earlier on in the era, it still didn't change this fact. And I think it's also just a prime example of how they have an issue establishing new talent, and they like to really rely on the same older cast members who have been the same way that they've been for the last 15 years, and it's really just tiring at this point in time. So, I was expecting Tori to make it on this list since they've been pushing her heavily since she debuted on Dirty 30, but obviously she had some early debuts on 3 of the seasons: Final Reckoning, Double Agent, and Total Madness, which is why she only had 4 seasons in this magnitude. But obviously she kicked them up a notch during the second half of the era, which is why she ended up making it here. So that really wasn't surprising. Nelson did surprise me with making it onto this list, since I didn't realize how well he did in Era 4. Obviously, he has these 5 seasons because he made it far on all 5 other seasons, but as we've seen before, there's been many scenarios where someone makes it to the end of a season, but they don't get all the confessionals. So the fact that Nelson got so many confessionals in so many seasons of the era, pushing him in a tie with Kyle, Johnny Bananas, and Carmere really says a lot. And if he didn't have that accident, he potentially could have made it even higher. So I do feel like that was interesting. And he's the only black person who's this high on the list for this era, which is very interesting. Kyle really isn't surprising to me, since out of all the people in Era 4, he did the most seasons with 7, and he made it far on all but one of them. So this really wasn't a surprise, but it shows how consistent and prominent he was during the time that he was on the show. So these, by this criteria, would be the main 5 people of Era 4. Now I am looking into the people who could have been the top of the faces of the era, and they were relatively supporting but notable people, as they had 3 seasons where they are a top 10 confessional giver, meaning that they are very prominent on 3 seasons, hence them being in another tier. And just from looking at this, there are only two Era 4 people who fit this category, with Cam and Polly being the two. And it's not unnoted to me that both of them are from early Era 4, where Cam made it on this list for Vendettas, Shockingly Final Reckoning, and Double Agents. So I'm assuming she was relatively under-edited on War of the Worlds 2 in comparison, which is why she wasn't there. But it was clear that they are trying to build her up more and more, and they are fairly comfortable with her being a potential face of the show at around the time of Double Agents, but she stepped back from the flagship show. Polly is arguably the most notable early era 4 Big Brother person to make it onto the show, and he definitely had a splash on his first 3 seasons from Final Reckoning through War of the Worlds 2, having a lot of power, making a lot of moves, and getting into a lot of drama. But his antics continued off season and on social media to the point where it caused him to not be on the show for several seasons. And when he did come back at the tail end of the era, he essentially flopped. There are 4 Era 3 people who made it on the list, with Jordan, which really isn't shocking, where he did 4 seasons of the era, but he's on this list for War of the Worlds 2, Ride or Dies, and Battle of the Eras, where he won 2 of them and was third place in the latter, and Ride or Dies was the season that had him and Tori interacted with one another since their breakup. So obviously they got a lot of screen time. The only other season that he did in this era was Total Madness, which was a flop season for him. Devin had a big season with Final Reckoning, with him finally taking out Bananas, but then he wasn't really on the next few seasons due to family issues and them just prioritizing other people. But when he came back at around Double Agent, it became clear that he's becoming more and more prominent, which led to him making it to 2 finals on Spies, Lies, and Allies, and finally winning Ride or Dies. So I'm not shocked that Devin is here. If he was a bit more consistent when it came to his performances on some of the other seasons, he would have been in that first group. Corey is someone that was clearly supposed to be built up from the time of his debut, but his early Era 4 seasons were really, really poor, and then with the whole incident with Tony, it caused him to not be on a few seasons, but he came back on Total Madness and seemingly got it together, which is why he made it to the end game of a lot of those era, or a lot of the later seasons. He made it to 2 finals, hence him being here for Total Madness and Double Agents, and was booted right before the final on Battle of the Eras. So it seems like with him coming down, he's becoming more prominent on the show and in the game. And then the final person on this list is Nani. She came back on War of the Worlds 1 after taking a few seasons off in late Era 3 and early Era 4, and she did 6 seasons in a row. But her first 3 seasons had her getting booted before the endgame or during the endgame, and she had her streak of final appearances from Double Agents to Ride or Dies, and those are the 3 seasons that she made it onto this list for. And then, of course, for Era 1, it's CT and Anissa, which has been the case since Era 3, and it really isn't shocking at all. So I don't really have much to say about them being here, as they're the only consistent Era 1 people at this point. And while there are other Era 1 people who made their debut here and there, they are nowhere near as consistent as Anissa and CT. So I'm going to conclude the Era 4 part and then later talk about the state of the show heading into Era 5, at least from my point of view. So in conclusion, this is the era that I started watching the challenge live, but even before watching a lot of the older seasons, I knew that there were a lot of issues, and it was clear that the show, honestly, you could say MTV in general, has an identity crisis. They know that how they ran the challenge for a decade up to that point wasn't really working anymore with the update in streaming, the real world being cancelled, Road Rules long since being cancelled, and with those shows being cancelled, a lot of the newbies being older regarding their age, and pulling from anywhere they can. I do think they dropped a ball with casting Are You the One further, where I feel like a lot of them, or like a lot of the ones from like Are You the One 6, 7, 8, Heck, even some of the X on the Beach seasons should have continued being cast and casting people from their other MTV shows. And while Big Brother and casting the UK people was a good choice, though there's many controversial choices with that, I do think those could have been base feeder areas or shows, and I think they jumped to casting international people way too soon as there's a huge language barrier with a lot of them. They didn't really know anyone, and if they don't know the language, it also causes them to struggle when it comes to production, the cast, and all that jazz. Due to a bunch of other issues, in addition to them not wanting to build on their newer castmates to become longtime veterans and not giving up on some of the stellar veterans that have been around forever now. This eventually caused for the high turnover rate with a lot of the rookies, especially during the second half of the era. And then I think just with the culture changing when it comes to things becoming a lot more progressive or a lot more, what's the word? A lot more sensitive. A lot of the more controversial people who would have been fine on prior eras were either put on pause or were essentially kicked off the show or not cast for the show again. In addition to that, because MTV is, let's be honest, falling, they decided to stretch the most popular show out by adding more episodes into the episode count and making the actual length of the episodes longer too, which caused for the second half of the era to feel even more dumb. They created a bunch of twists that justified the ninth or quote unquote justified the 19 episode format, so it just became really, really stale. They started editing out a lot of the drama. And shows like The Challenge and The Real World thrive on controversy and conflict when it comes to real life stuff, culture, race, sex, maybe politics, and a whole bunch of the isms and other real life topics and discussions. But with Era 4, they started editing out all of that. So we just got a really sanitized show. And then this was the era where they added a bunch of the spin offs, and I felt like them doing this really also negatively affected Era 4, where they put so much focus on other things instead of making their main flagship show good, and it bit them in the butt, where the only one that actually lasted was All Stars. This might be my least favorite era, though I'm definitely thinking of Era 1 because there are so many formatting issues with like the first 5 to 6, maybe even 7 seasons of Era 1. So Era 4 might beat it out Era 1, but honestly, a lot of the vibes of Era 4 just wasn't really the good, and it's clear that the show's well past its peak, and it's really unfortunate. So the state of the challenge. So I don't have much to go off of with this since literally they just announced a decent amount of the 41 cast, and I want to wait a bit until we get more names before I go over that cast. But just from the looks of it, it seems like they're sticking with the same tired old veterans, with the exception of a few that really don't add much of anything to the show anymore. I get that they're production based and they're probably easy to work with, but when you're paying these people so much money, they don't bring anything new, and you're really kind of just screwing over new stories that could have been formed by their newer castmates, and consistently dropping them after 1 to 2 seasons, it really causes a stale, dated feeling of the show. And I think that's the issue with the challenge now. It just feels very dated. It's the same old people, the same old winners, they're really not adapting well. And I think that's just the issue with MTV in general. Speaking of MTV, there is a lot going on where I believe a production company or a network called Skydance is in the midst of buying Paramount, which means all the subsidiaries under Paramount will go with it, and they're supposedly not planning on prioritizing MTV, and it's just kind of waiting for it to die out. So that doesn't have me very confident about the future of MTV or the show, but that might not be finalized for another few years. When it comes to the actual show or the actual franchise, I do think now that they learned that they need to stop with the pointless spin-offs. Obviously, the World spin-offs utterly failed, which is why they haven't produced any of them in 2 years. And looking at the production schedule of the seasons that were done in 2024, which was the Challenge 40 and the Challenge All Stars 5. I think they're just going to kind of just repeat that schedule for the next few years. And we are already seeing it with 41 starting filming a few days ago as I'm recording this. And I'm assuming All Star 6 will film in the spring as well. So those two will be airing. And with All Stars 5 airing on MTV now, I think they're just going to air All Star 6 and whatever future seasons on MTV, especially with Paramount Plus going under even quicker than MTV in general. So I do think that they're not going to take much risks with a lot of the veterans. They're just going to keep the same group of people that have been dominating, even though they really aren't liked by the fans. I think they're going to kind of ignore a lot of the late era for people now, especially with how they casted for 41. I think the battle for a new champion group, I don't think many of them are going to come back. It seems like they are bringing back some of the older era 4 people, and some of the people they're bringing from the All Stars spin-offs to the flagship, though the choices that they're making when it comes to that transition really isn't the best. I think we're going to stick with the 19 episode count for the flagship for however long that they need to. So that's not going to be good. And that means we're going to get the same old tired formats to justify it. We don't know too much yet, but I do think that they need to get to the flagship show together. I think trying to build a cast solely on the newer people, which was 39, didn't work out well. I don't think that their nostalgia bait of Battle of the Eras really worked out well. So I think that they really need to figure out what they want to do, or else the show's just going to fall under. I also have to address the All Stars element and how that's going to affect Era 5, especially with All Stars 5, including a lot of Era 3 and Era 4 people, where in the past it seemed like there's a distinction between the two shows, where All Stars was for the OGs who can't afford to do the regular show or simply don't have any ties to the regular show regarding the cast, the formatting, or it just films too long. But with him casting a lot of Era 4 and Era 3 people who should do the flagship and are available to do the flagship, it seems like there's really no difference between the two shows anymore. The only difference is anyone who's willing to film for 2.5 to 3 months for the flagship, and people who are willing to film for a month for the All Stars spinoff. So that's definitely a concern, and it doesn't help with the lack of interchangeability between the two shows and the overall modern seasons in general. It seems like they're just going to film two seasons in the same location. That's been something they've been doing for at least the last 3 years at this point, so I think that's going to continue. And it also seems like they're going to continue casting from CBS shows, so Big Brother, Survivor, The Amazing Race, just from what I see on the 41 cast and how they've cast the last few seasons. It seems like they're still going to cast a lot of UK people, and they're going to continue casting international people. But the type of international people from the certain countries, I don't know how they're going to handle all of that. But I definitely think that this huge identity crisis that the show's under is an issue. And I don't think they know how to really handle it. I think a lot of the people who are on all sorry, not All Stars, Battle of the Eras, they either be relegated back to All Stars or they just won't do the show again. I think only a select group of them will be on the flagship. And it seems like a lot of the Era 4 newbies are kind of getting phased out at this point just from looking at how things are changing and what's been said so far. I hope that the show or the producers realize that they need to add more fun to the show. That was the main draw of the show, where it was people who had fun, who were doing all of these ridiculous challenges. We're all drinking, sleeping with one another, fighting with each other. It almost had like a university beach vibe as well. And that vibe especially went away this era, and it really caused for things to be dreary and kind of bland. It caused the show to lose its identity, and I think they kind of forgot what draw or what drew people in. no matter what they say, the show is not a fifth sport. It has never been a fifth sport because the show doesn't have consistent rules or guidelines that a sport would need. Heck, it's not even a game show anymore because of this. So I'm trying to be optimistic, but I'm not too down on it. It'll be interesting to watch though, to see how things change with Era 5. If we'll even get another 5 seasons or another 10 seasons of the flagship show. And I really hope that they get it together for 41. But yeah, that is my coverage of Era 4 and all the eras of the challenge. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with some more content soon. Take care.